Jimmy Hoffa vanished on July 30th, 1975, and no one has seen him since. Tonight, we begin the quiet unraveling of one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries, the disappearance of a man who once held more power than some senators, who could bring cities to a standstill with a single decision, and whose name still lingers like a ghost in the corridors of American history. His name was James Riddle Hoffa, and the story of his rise, his enemies, and his disappearance is a shadowed path through the heart of the 20th century. So let's begin slowly, calmly, by stepping back into that world. A world of rising unions and crumbling trust, smoky backrooms and whispered deals, where ambition, loyalty, and danger walked side by side. Jimmy Hoffa was born in 1913 in a quiet town called Brazil, Indiana. His father, a coal miner, died when Jimmy was just 7 years old. Not long after, his mother moved the family to Detroit, hoping for a better life in the rapidly industrializing city. It was there, in the heart of the Midwest's manufacturing boom, that Hoffa grew up surrounded by hard labor and harder lives. By 14, he had left school and started working full-time. He wasn't a large man, just over 5 feet 5 inches tall, but he had presence. Even in his teens, people listened when he spoke. At 19, he organized his first strike, a successful protest against poor working conditions at a grocery warehouse. It was the beginning of a lifetime spent fighting for labor rights. Soon, Hoffa became involved with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, a union of truck drivers, warehouse workers, and laborers that was growing rapidly in power and numbers. Hoffa's energy, charisma, and photographic memory made him a natural leader. He was tireless, relentless, and he knew how to get results. By the 1940s, Hoffa was already a rising star in the union world. But it wasn't just his labor organizing that got attention. It was also the rumors, quiet, persistent claims that Hoffa had made a deal, or several, with organized crime. The Mafia, too, had noticed the Teamsters, their vast pension fund, the growing membership, and their control over transportation routes made the union a tempting target. And Hoffa, seeing the opportunity to build something bigger, let them in. Whether out of necessity or strategy, it was a decision that would define his life and his disappearance. By 1957, Hoffa had become president of the Teamsters. Under his leadership, membership soared past 2 million. The Teamsters became the most powerful union in the United States. Hoffa could influence national policy, shut down entire industries, and direct billions of dollars in pension funds. But with power came enemies. One of the most determined was Robert F. Kennedy, brother of President John F. Kennedy. As Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy launched an aggressive campaign against organized crime and made Hoffa his personal target. During Senate hearings, the two men clashed repeatedly. Hoffa, defiant and confident, mocked the proceedings. Kennedy, cold and focused, vowed to bring him down. Their rivalry became legendary. "I don't need bodyguards," Hoffa once told reporters. "I've got the people." In 1964, Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering and misusing union pension funds. He was sentenced to 13 years in prison, and in 1967, he entered the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary. But even behind bars, Hoffa remained a force. He continued to influence union decisions from prison. The loyalty he commanded didn't fade. In many ways, it deepened. Then, in a surprising move, President Richard Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence in 1971. He was released after serving less than 5 years. But there was a catch. Nixon had included a provision barring Hoffa from engaging in union activity until 1980. Still, Hoffa had no intention of staying silent. He began quietly planning his return, meeting with allies, gauging support. and preparing to challenge Frank Fitzsimmons, the man who had taken over the Teamsters presidency in Hoffa's absence. Fitzsimmons, however, had built close ties with the Mafia, and many in the Underworld feared Hoffa's return would upset their control. On the morning of July 30th, 1975, Hoffa left his home in Lake Orion, Michigan. He told his wife he was going to meet two men for lunch at the Matus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township: Tony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters official, and Tony Giacalone, a known Detroit mobster. Hoffa arrived at the restaurant around 2 p.m. Witnesses saw him pacing the parking lot, looking at his watch. He was reportedly frustrated that his lunch companions were late, and then he never came home. That evening, Hoffa's green Pontiac Granville was found still parked at the restaurant. The doors were unlocked. The keys were in the ignition, but Hoffa was gone. Gone without a sound, without a witness, without a trace. News of his disappearance broke quickly. For the American public, it was like watching a myth collapse into fog. Jimmy Hoffa, the once untouchable labor kingpin, had simply disappeared. Police launched a massive search. The FBI joined immediately. Within days, helicopters combed nearby woods, dogs sniffed through fields, divers searched local lakes. But no body was found. No blood, no signs of a struggle, just silence. Speculation ran wild. Some said he had been abducted and killed by the Mafia to prevent his return to power. Others believed he had been taken to a nearby house, murdered and cremated. A few claimed he was buried under Giants Stadium in New Jersey. Others insisted he was cut into pieces and dumped in a steel drum, shipped away on a freighter. Investigators followed hundreds of leads. Decades passed, but nothing concrete ever surfaced. In 1982, Hoffa was declared legally dead, but the mystery lived on. To this day, the question remains: was it betrayal by those closest to him, a silencing ordered from the highest ranks of organized crime, or something more complex? A man undone by the very power he spent his life building. What we do know is this: Jimmy Hoffa was more than a labor leader. He was a symbol of American ambition, corruption, resilience, and danger, all bound up in one relentless figure. And on that warm afternoon in July, the man who had once held America's working class in the palm of his hand simply disappeared. The day Jimmy Hoffa vanished, he had planned to meet two men for lunch. Men who could have been friends, or at least allies, in his world of shadowy deals and underground power plays. Yet, in the world that Hoffa had made his own, there was a fine line between a friend and an enemy. A line so fine, in fact, that sometimes it was hard to tell them apart. One of these men was Anthony Tony Provenzano, a powerful figure in the New Jersey Teamsters, a man with connections to the Mafia. Hoffa had known Tony for years, but their relationship had always been rocky. They had clashed more than once, and at the time of Hoffa's disappearance, their friendship seemed to be at a breaking point. The reasons for their tensions are murky, but it is believed that Hoffa, upon his release from prison, wanted to reclaim his position in the Union. Provenzano, however, had become the beneficiary of Hoffa's absence, and he had no intention of relinquishing his newfound power. The second man Hoffa was supposed to meet that day was Tony Giacalone, a notorious figure in the Detroit underworld. Giacalone's connections were so deep and wide that he was often referred to as the king of Detroit's organized crime scene. He was a figure who moved in and out of the shadows with such ease that one could almost believe he existed solely in the dark corners of the city. These were the men Hoffa was supposed to trust. Friends, yes, in a way. Men who had helped him climb the ladder of power, just as Hoffa had helped them in turn. But their friendship was built on a shaky foundation. It was a world where loyalty was often a fleeting thing, and ambition was a far more permanent driving force. But Hoffa had no real allies in the world he had created, not even among those closest to him. He had made deals with men like Provenzano and Giacoloni, but they were also men who had no qualms about taking him down, if it served their interests. And it is here, in this murky, treacherous landscape of power, betrayal, and hidden loyalties. It's tempting, isn't it, to think that Hoffa's disappearance was simply the result of a betrayal from these men, that they had grown tired of him, that they had finally decided it was time to silence him for good. But there is something about this case, something in the way Hoffa's story unfolds, that suggests the involvement of forces much larger than a handful of Mafia men. As Hoffa had risen to power, so too had his enemies. Those enemies, far more powerful than any mobster, moved in the shadows of government, corporate boardrooms, and even the corridors of the White House. Hoffa's alliances with the Mafia had drawn the attention of more than just law enforcement. His ties to organized crime were known, and they made him a target for much more than just union rivals. There were whispers, buried in the background of the larger story, that Hoffa's disappearance was tied to the highest levels of government. People who had seen too much, learned too much, or, in Hoffa's case, perhaps became too much of a problem for those in power. We know that Hoffa's ties to the Mafia had begun to draw the attention of the federal government, particularly during the 1960s when Robert F. Kennedy was serving as Attorney General. His relentless pursuit of Hoffa had made it clear that the labor leader was more than just a union boss. He was a man whose influence could shape the fate of whole industries, cities, and, some believed, even governments. By the time Hoffa was released from prison, it was clear that his influence had become a threat. The Teamsters, under Hoffa, had amassed power that rivaled that of entire political parties. There were rumors that Hoffa had grown more ambitious after his release, considering ways to reclaim the Teamsters' leadership and secure the future of the pension fund. In fact, it's believed that Hoffa was attempting to wrest control from Frank Fitzsimmons, who had taken over during Hoffa's time in prison. The Teamsters had their hands in almost every sector of American industry: transportation, construction, entertainment, and even politics. Hoffa knew how to wield that power, or rather, he had once known. And now, as the years went by, those in charge of the country, the ones with their fingers on the pulse of economic life, began to see Hoffa's return as a threat. The whispers grew louder. Could his return threaten the delicate balance that had been set in motion? It is here, in this space between known facts and wild theories, that we begin to understand the true stakes of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance. We know that Hoffa had enemies in the Mafia, yes, but perhaps he had enemies in the highest echelons of American power, people whose names we may never know, but whose hands might have been just as stained with blood. The days following Hoffa's disappearance were filled with chaos, speculation, and fear. His allies in the Teamsters, those still loyal to him, were scrambling to find him. They reached out to the FBI, to local authorities, to anyone who might have a clue. The investigation was a whirlwind of half-truths, dead ends, and false leads. In the days and months that followed, the authorities would try to make sense of the silence. But the more they dug, the more it became clear. This wasn't just a Mafia hit. Something far larger, far more intricate, was at play. The press, too, was drawn into the web of mystery. Reporters worked tirelessly, chasing down every lead, interviewing every person who might have had even the smallest piece of information. Their investigation uncovered a complex network of names, dates, and events, but no one could offer the final answer. It was a story so tangled that even seasoned journalists found themselves lost in its depth. The FBI, too, was caught up in the story. Their investigation, which would last for decades, would uncover a dizzying array of connections, rumors, and dead ends. They would interview dozens of suspects, from mobsters to union officials, and even more distant figures who might have known something. But the truth remained elusive. What happened to Hoffa? Was he taken by his Mafia enemies? Or was there a more sinister force at work? In the years that followed, the mystery deepened even further. New theories emerged, each more outlandish than the last. Some speculated that Hoffa had gone into hiding, fleeing the very people who wanted him dead. Others claimed that he had been murdered and disposed of in a way so meticulous that it was as though he had never existed at all. There was, however, one thing that became undeniable. Hoffa had enemies in places far higher than even he had ever imagined. Men who could reach into the depths of his world, manipulating, shaping, and controlling everything around them. It's impossible to say how far those forces reached, but it is clear that Hoffa's disappearance was more than just a mob hit. It was a ripple in the very fabric of American power, a story with twists and turns that will forever leave us questioning the nature of loyalty, power, and truth. July 30th, the day Jimmy Hoffa vanished, a seemingly ordinary day for a man whose life was anything but. The most peculiar part of the story begins with what should have been a simple lunch meeting at the McHugh's Red Fox restaurant, just outside Detroit. A gathering that would end up becoming the centerpiece of the most puzzling mystery in American history. Hoffa had planned to meet two men that afternoon: Tony Provenzano, a powerful figure in the Teamsters and a mobster with ties to the Genovese crime family, and Tony Giacalone, a respected Detroit mobster. The purpose was simply attempting to broker peace, reconnecting with old allies, and easing the tension that had been building ever since Hoffa's release from prison in 1971. But what was supposed to be a reunion of old friends, a gesture of compromise, became a haunting moment in history. Hoffa arrived at the restaurant shortly before 2 p.m., and he was, as always, dressed to impressed dark suit, crisp and neat. He waited and waited. Provenzano, who had initially been the key to Hoffa's return to power within the Teamsters, did not show up. Giacalone, too, failed to appear. Hoffa's patience wore thin, and by 2:30 p.m., he began making calls. The first to his wife, Josephine, to let her know about the delay. "They're late," Hoffa told her, his frustration creeping into his tone. The restaurant, with its cozy booths and quiet atmosphere, was not the sort of place one would expect to mark the scene of such a pivotal event. The McHugh's Red Fox had an understated charm, perhaps intentionally so. It was secluded enough to host discreet meetings, but it wasn't the kind of place where major mob dealings took place. This meeting, however, would defy all expectations and leave an indelible mark on the world. As the minutes turned into an hour, Hoffa grew restless. He knew the two men well enough to understand that this wasn't typical of them. Both Provenzano and Giacalone had a certain reputation. They were men of action, men who didn't keep people waiting. Something felt off. Something felt wrong. Yet Hoffa remained seated in that booth, staring at the door, waiting. What was going through his mind? Was he waiting for a confrontation? For some sort of explanation? Or did he already suspect the trap that was slowly closing around him? By 2:45 p.m., the restaurant's staff and patrons began to take note of the odd situation. Hoffa was still alone. Some say he sat quietly, while others claim he was growing agitated, pacing. He had been in rooms like this before, with people just as dangerous, but this time the air was different. There was an uncertainty, a feeling that what would happen next could change everything. Hoffa, for all his bravado and years of power, had no way of knowing how pivotal that moment would be. Around the time he was due to meet the two Tonys, Hoffa made one final call. He contacted his confidant, his old friend and fellow Teamster, who would later reveal the last words Hoffa spoke that afternoon. "I'm getting tired of waiting," Hoffa had said. "They're not here, and they're not calling. I'll give it another half hour, and then I'm leaving." But Hoffa didn't leave. He didn't leave because he never had the chance. At 2:45 p.m., the phone call ended, and Hoffa's fate was sealed. It wasn't until later that afternoon that Hoffa's car, a dark green 1974 Oldsmobile, was found parked in the restaurant lot, empty. Not a single trace of Hoffa anywhere. The vehicle, however, held a clue, a faint smudge of his blood on the seat. But that was it. No signs of a struggle, no indication of violence, no clues as to where Hoffa had gone. At first, some believed he had simply left the meeting. Maybe he had walked away, perhaps frustrated by the delay, maybe hoping to avoid confrontation. But that idea quickly fell apart. Hoffa's associates, his trusted friends, knew that leaving without notice was not something he would do. He had been a man of control, of precision. He would not have just vanished. As hours turned to days, the mystery deepened. Was Hoffa taken? Was this the work of the Mafia, whose ties to the Teamsters were well documented and full of tension? Or was something else at play? Theories began to swirl. Some believed Hoffa had been lured into a trap. Others insisted he had been taken by forces with ties to higher places outside the scope of the Underworld. Could Hoffa have been the victim of a political plot, a move orchestrated by those seeking to control the power he held? One of the strangest aspects of Hoffa's disappearance was the lack of immediate answers. The world expected that, by now, someone would have come forward, someone would have known. But even as weeks passed, no one came forward, no one with the answers everyone so desperately needed. Even the Mafia, so often able to close ranks when necessary, seemed unable to explain what had happened to Jimmy Hoffa. There was, of course, one man who claimed to know more. Robert F. Kennedy, the former U.S. Attorney General, had a unique perspective on Hoffa's disappearance. At the height of the investigation, Kennedy, despite all the evidence pointing toward Hoffa's death, made a peculiar claim. He believed that Hoffa was still alive, somewhere, hidden away. He had hoped that one day Hoffa would resurface, returning to the world he had once dominated. Yet, his absence became more than just a disappearance, became a symbol of the dangers that lurked behind closed doors, of the secrets that people were willing to go to great lengths to protect. And so, the question remains, what really happened at that lunch meeting? Was it a trap? Was Hoffa's fate sealed before he even stepped into the restaurant? Or was there something more, something darker, at play? We may never know. But Hoffa's disappearance continues to haunt the corridors of history, unanswered and unresolved. The investigation into Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance unfolded in ways that few could have predicted. Despite an initial rush of speculation, theories, and the endless search for clues, Hoffa had simply vanished, as if he had been swallowed by the earth itself. His sudden and complete disappearance from the McHugh's Red Fox restaurant seemed almost impossible to fathom. And yet, as days turned into weeks, law enforcement, local and federal, scoured the surrounding areas for any signs of Hoffa. They combed through abandoned buildings, searched deep into the woods, even examined the Detroit River. The search stretched on, but it was as though Hoffa had disappeared into thin air. His body was never found. No ransom note ever arrived. No witness came forward with a story that could lead them to the truth. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything, that could explain what had happened. The most unsettling aspect of the case was how clean it seemed. Nothing seemed out of place at the scene of his disappearance. His car was left behind, parked at the restaurant in the lot where it had been all afternoon. The only hint of something amiss was a faint trace of blood found on the front seat. But this didn't lead to any further clues. It wasn't enough to piece together a theory. It was as if Hoffa had simply walked into the restaurant, sat down to wait for his meeting, and then poof was gone. The police, despite all their efforts, couldn't make sense of what had happened. At the time, there were no major leads, no solid suspects, just shadows and whispers in dark rooms. The more they delved into Hoffa's past, the more they realized how vast the web of possible suspects truly was. Hoffa wasn't just a union leader, he was a man connected to people with power, not just in labor, but in the criminal world as well. Could it have been one of his old allies who had turned on him? Or was it a final retribution from those who wanted to silence him for good? A number of theories began to emerge, none of which could be definitively proven, but all had their merit. Some believed that Hoffa had been murdered, and that the body was simply hidden, perhaps buried deep in the ground where it could never be found. Others speculated that he had been taken by the Mafia, perhaps to be made an example of. The Genovese family had the means and the motive to eliminate Hoffa for all. His return to the Teamsters was seen by many as a threat to the delicate balance of power that had been struck. Hoffa's relationship with Tony Provenzano had been tense for some time, and Giacalone, despite his proximity to Hoffa, had always seemed to walk a fine line between loyalty and self-interest. But there was something else. There was a sense that Hoffa's disappearance was more than just a Mafia hit. It felt like it could have been something far more elaborate, perhaps political. A response to Hoffa's increasing attempts to regain his influence in American labor. His power had waned after his time in prison, but he had returned with a sense of purpose, seeking to reclaim what he had once held. Could someone have feared his return to prominence? Someone with more to lose than the Mafia? The idea lingered in the background like a fog, casting doubt on the possibility that Hoffa's disappearance could be reduced to a single, simple explanation. The FBI, under pressure from both the public and the authorities, launched an extensive investigation. They interviewed dozens of people, and still, the case grew colder by the day. They questioned Hoffa's closest associates, but no one was willing to speak. No one came forward with hard evidence. Even Hoffa's closest friends, those who had known him the longest, had no answers. It was as if the entire situation was shrouded in silence, a veil that refused to lift. How could a man who had been so visible, so much a part of the fabric of American labor and politics, disappear without leaving a trace? It was the kind of mystery that stirred the mind, yet frustrated every attempt to understand it. In the following weeks, the search seemed almost futile. Theories were tossed around like cards in a gambler's hand, each one a possibility, but none of them real enough to stand on their own. One of the more popular theories was that Hoffa's body had been buried in a concrete foundation, perhaps even in one of the many buildings under construction around the time of his disappearance. There were even rumors that his body had been crushed in a compactor, ground into an unrecognizable pulp. It was a chilling thought. Hoffa, once a towering figure in the labor movement, now reduced to mere dust, perhaps buried beneath layers of concrete and forgotten history. Then there was the theory that Hoffa had been taken across the border, hidden in plain sight somewhere in Canada. Some believed that Hoffa had staged his own disappearance, possibly with the help of others who wanted to ensure that he was never found. Had he gone underground, using his own resources and connections to disappear entirely? It seemed unlikely, yet it was a possibility that kept people wondering. Despite the chilling theories and mounting questions, the most unnerving thing about Hoffa's disappearance was the fact that it didn't seem to matter. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and still the search turned up nothing. Hoffa's wife, Josephine, who had been anxiously waiting for any word about her husband's fate, was left with no answers. The public, too, was left in a kind of suspended disbelief. How could someone so powerful, so central to the history of the American labor movement, simply vanish without a trace? The questions lingered unanswered as the case drifted further into the realm of speculation and mystery. The FBI continued their investigation, but there was no progress. No one was ever charged. No new leads came to light. The case, for all its intrigue and national attention, remained unsolved. It was as though the truth had vanished along with Hoffa, hiding somewhere in the depths of time, locked away in a place where no one could reach. And so, we are left to wonder, what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa? Where did he go? Was it a murder, a disappearance of his own making? Or was there something larger at play? Something beyond the scope of what we can understand? The silence of that afternoon in the parking lot, the uncertainty of his final moments all continues to linger, a quiet echo in the corridors of history. As the years go by, the mystery of Hoffa's disappearance grows only more profound. Yet, one thing remains certain. Hoffa's absence has left a hole in history, a missing piece that continues to draw those who seek answers into the depths of its mystery. Sometimes, to understand a vanishing, you have to trace the lines not of where someone was last signed, but of who was bound to them. Blood ties, business ties, shadow ties. The kind that don't leave fingerprints, but leave impressions. And with Jimmy Hoffa, those ties always led back to one dark and well-traveled road, the intersection of organized labor and organized crime. For years before his disappearance, Hoffa had been more than just a union boss. He was, in many ways, a gatekeeper between the working man and the underworld, and he wielded that position with both strength and confidence. But the deeper you peer into his relationships, the more tangled the web becomes. Names like Tony Provenzano, Carlos Marcello, and Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone aren't just distant echoes in the story. They're voices that may have whispered his fate. Let's start with the Teamsters. At its height, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters boasted over 2 million members. Truck drivers, warehouse workers, freight handlers, working men and women who relied on the union to negotiate fair wages and protect their rights. But with power came opportunity, and the Teamsters' immense pension fund worth over $1 billion at one point was a tempting prize. It became a hidden artery through which millions in loans flowed, often not toward worker welfare, but toward mafia-owned casinos, hotels, and construction projects. This wasn't just conspiracy. It was known, documented, confirmed through Senate hearings and FBI files. The pension fund had, for years, been used as a private bank for mob bosses. It was Hoffa who helped open that vault. Now, Jimmy didn't invent the connection between the Teamsters and the Mafia. Those lines were already there before him, but he deepened them, used them, perhaps even believed he could control them. He was transactional, sharp. If someone could deliver votes or keep a strike in check, Hoffa was willing to look the other way. One of the most significant names tied to Hoffa was Anthony Provenzano, known on the street as Tony Pro, a capo in the Genovese crime family and a Teamsters vice president. On the surface, they had worked together, fought side by side for union power. But by the early 1970s, their relationship had soured into something bitter, even dangerous. Hoffa reportedly feared Provenzano. During his prison sentence at Lewisburg Penitentiary, Hoffa and Provenzano had served time together and clashed violently. There were threats. Rumors that Tony Pro had once said he'd pull out Hoffa's guts and stuff them down his throat. When Hoffa tried to return to union leadership in the mid-70s, Provenzano allegedly stood in his way, making it clear that Hoffa's time was over. And still, on the day he disappeared, Hoffa expected to meet with Provenzano. That's a question that's never been fully answered. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe he thought the old rules of respect still applied. Or maybe he thought he still had some cards left to play. Then there was Giacomo Need, a reputed mafia figure in Detroit, known for his slick appearance and quiet menace. He had a reputation for mediation, for keeping things smooth between factions. Hoffa had ties to him too. Giacoloni had been seen in the vicinity of the McHugh's Red Fox that day. He insisted, later, that he had been elsewhere, at a health club. Giacoloni's name kept coming up in interviews, whispered behind closed doors and printed cautiously in newspapers. But just like with Provenzano, there was never enough to hold him accountable. The reach of organized crime within the Teamsters went far beyond Detroit. In Las Vegas, mob money poured into hotels and casinos built using pension loans. In Chicago, New York, Miami, everywhere, the Teamsters had presence. So too did the families. Frank Sheeran, another player in this dark tale, claimed to have killed Hoffa on behalf of the Mafia. Confession recounted in Charles Brandt's book, I Heard You Paint Houses. But even that admission is debated by experts and historians. No physical evidence ever surfaced. No charges were filed. Just words on a page, and the silence of time. What's strange, what lingers in the mind late at night, it's how ordinary it all looked from the outside. Business meetings, union conferences, golf outings and dinner parties. But beneath the surface was a current of influence, favors, and fear. The lines between labor leader and mob associate blurred in ways that the average person might never have seen. But Hoffa lived inside that blur. He thrived in it. And perhaps, in the end, he drowned in it. J. Edgar Hoover had long denied the existence of the Mafia, even as it flourished under his nose. But by the 1970s, the FBI had shifted focus. The RICO Act gave investigators new tools, new angles. They began unraveling the threads connecting unions to crime families. And yet, even with all those resources, they couldn't stop what happened to Hoffa, couldn't predict it, couldn't prevent it. One former federal prosecutor said, the problem wasn't that Hoffa had enemies. It was that everyone was his enemy. The mob, the union, the government. He was surrounded. That image of a man encircled by those who once needed him feels chilling, lonely. Like a king who thought the crown still held power, only to find the throne empty and the court gone cold. Even now, when you read the old files or listen to the grainy recordings of wiretapped conversations, you can feel the tension. The way people said Hoffa's name, softly, cautiously, like invoking something dangerous. That, to me, says a lot. He wasn't just a union boss. He was a symbol, a threat, a man who knew too much. And in a world built on secrets, sometimes knowing too much is enough to make you vanish. We still don't know who gave the final order, if there even was one. It may have been a quiet decision made around a table. No shouting, no violence, just a nod. A consensus that the old man had become more trouble than he was worth. Somewhere in that smoky back room, the lights flickered, the glasses clinked, and Jimmy Hoffa's name was spoken for the last time. And then, silence. The silence that follows power. The silence that follows blood ties. The kind of silence that never fully lifts. Some mysteries are made of whispers and glances, of things left unsaid, but others leave behind the sound of shovels in the earth. Quiet at first, then more frantic, like someone digging for ghosts. After Hoffa vanished, the silence didn't last long. Law enforcement swept in quickly, cars pulling up, agents in suits knocking on doors, phones ringing in back offices. But as the days turned into weeks, and then months, the search shifted, from urgent manhunt to something slower, something heavier. A kind of archaeological hunt for truth, buried not just in dirt, but in layers of secrecy. The first serious efforts to find Hoffa's remains began in the late 1970s. But without a clear crime scene, every theory became a possible map. There were tips, hundreds of them. Some called from payphones, others scribbled anonymous notes. "Check the landfill," one would say. "He's under the slab," another claimed. The FBI logged them all, pinned them to corkboards, traced phone lines that ended in static. In 1975, shortly after the disappearance, authorities focused on a Cara Mercury Marquis broom registered to Chucky O'Brien, Hoffa's foster son. O'Brien had claimed he was nowhere near the scene, but dog hair and traces of Hoffa's scent were found in the car. Still, it wasn't enough. No charges, no confession, just more fog. Then came the digs. One of the most infamous search efforts took place in Bloomfield Township, Michigan, in 1976. Acting on a tip from a prison inmate, the FBI brought in backhoes and excavators, tearing into a horse farm once owned by a known mob associate. The field was wide and lonely, grass flattened beneath tires, soil turned dark with effort. But after days of digging, nothing. And yet, some claimed Hoffa had been dismembered and tossed into a junkyard crusher. Others said his body had been sealed inside a 55-gallon drum and buried beneath a shopping center, or beneath concrete at a mob-connected landfill in New Jersey. In 2003, the FBI took another swing, this time in Milwaukee, following leads that he had been shipped there in a meat truck. Another search in 2006 had agents excavating farmland in Milford Township, Michigan, after new claims emerged. A barn was dismantled, the ground dug down to its bones. Each time, media circled like birds over open ground, cameras recording holes where answers should be. But the earth kept its secrets. And then there was the grandest of all the tales, the legend of Giant Stadium. It started as a joke, a kind of urban myth, but, like many jokes, it carried a note of something darker. The claim was that Hoffa had been buried in the concrete foundation of the old Giant Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey. The stadium broke ground in 1972 and opened in 1976, just a year after Hoffa disappeared. According to a self-described mob hitman named Donald Tony the Greek Francos, Hoffa's body had been stuffed into a steel drum and placed beneath one of the end zones. The idea caught on. It was repeated in interviews on late-night shows, even whispered from one generation to the next. For years, it became part of American folklore. But when the stadium was demolished in 2010, investigators were allowed to inspect the area and found nothing. Still, that rumor stuck. Maybe because it felt fitting. A man who had towered over American labor, entombed beneath one of its greatest sporting arenas. But myths are stubborn things. They fill in the spaces where facts refuse to go. The FBI's biggest dig came much later, in 2013, when they descended on a field in Oakland Township, north of Detroit. The site had once belonged to Tony Zerli, another mob figure, who had claimed that Hoffa was buried there in a shallow grave. Agents brought in ground-penetrating radar, canine units. For days, they worked beneath the sun, guarded and silent. But again, nothing. Just more Michigan dirt, cold and quiet. What makes all of this even more haunting is how real it all felt at the time. These weren't conspiracy cranks or tabloids chasing shadows. They believed they were close. They always did. But truth can be like that, always seeming just one dig away. In an interview from 2004, former U.S. Attorney Keith Corbett said something that still echoes. Hoffa's not missing because people don't know what happened. He's missing because the people who know aren't talking. That silence, more than any burial site, may be the real tomb. And you start to wonder, did the people who made Hoffa disappear plan it this way? Was the body hidden so deliberately, so permanently, that it became not just a murder, but a message? Because not finding Hoffa might be more powerful than finding him. It's strange, isn't it? To think of a man so public, so loud, so unmissable. No photos, no traces. Just these holes in the ground, dug by men hoping to find bones, dug by men chasing shadows. I sometimes imagine those fields late at night, quiet now, grass growing back over the scars, the wind moving softly through the trees, and beneath it all, nothing. Or maybe it's that uncertainty that keeps the story alive. It's why we dig, not just with shovels, but with questions. We're not just looking for a body, we're looking for meaning, for closure, for proof that the world makes sense, that wrongs get righted, that powerful men don't simply vanish without consequence. But sometimes they do. The winds haven't settled. Not really. Not in the minds of those who knew him. Not in the offices where cold case files still sit like ghosts in manila folders. And certainly not in the hearts of those who wonder what Jimmy Hoffa might have said if he'd had time for a last word. Because even when the trail seemed cold, the whispers never stopped. There's something eerie about a mystery that grows older without growing quieter. Like a house where footsteps are still heard long after the lights go out. Hoffa's disappearance became more than a case-it, became a legend, and with legend comes echoes, quiet claims, half-truths, deathbed confessions. Some of them were bizarre, others felt eerily plausible, but all of them shared one thing in common. They came from men who had walked close to the shadows. Men who had lived long enough to want to clear their conscience or stir the pot one final time. Take, for instance, the story of Richard the Iceman Kuklinski, a hitman for various Mafia families. Kuklinski claimed in his final years that he had been involved in Hoffa's murder. According to him, Hoffa had been abducted, killed, and his body placed in a drum, set ablaze, and later compacted with other scrap metal to be shipped overseas. It was a brutal tale, told with chilling calm in his prison interviews. But Kuklinski was a complicated man. He confessed to many things, some verified, many not. The FBI never substantiated his version of events. Still, the way he told it, you couldn't help but listen. Then there was Frank the Irishman Sheeran, a trusted Teamster official and one-time associate of Hoffa. In 2004, just before his death, Sheeran spoke to writer Charles Brandt, claiming he had been the one to pull the trigger, that he had taken Hoffa to a house in Detroit, shot him in the back of the head, and left him there. The book I Heard You Paint Houses became a sensation. Later adapted into a film by Martin Scorsese, it introduced a whole new generation to Hoffa's story. Sheeran's version had details that rang true, timelines, names, locations that matched FBI intelligence, but even his confession had cracks. Forensic tests at the Detroit house came up empty. No blood, no trace. Just an old story with a fresh coat of paint. Still, there's a weight to Sheeran's voice in those final interviews. Like a man trying to spit out a bitter truth before it's too late. One agent who worked the case for decades, Andrew Sluss, once said, "There were too many people who knew what happened. The secret's not being kept. It's been told, just in fragments." And maybe that's the truth of it. That the full picture exists, scattered across half-spoken words and fading memories, like pieces of a puzzle whose corners have been burned away. In 1982, Hoffa was declared legally dead, but it never felt like the end. Because the moment you declare someone dead without a body, something shifts. Doubt creeps in. You start to wonder, was it staged? Was he taken overseas? Did he cut a deal and disappear himself? These theories danced along the margins, fueled by a lack of closure. Even his family had different beliefs. His son, James P. Hoffa, who later led the Teamsters union himself, has long believed his father was murdered and that the Mafia was involved. but even he has said, more than once, that he doubts the full story will ever come out. And it's here that the whispers get personal. Because when you've spent enough time around this case, you start to see the toll. Detectives who kept boxes of Hoffa files in their basements long after retirement. Journalists who would wake up in the middle of the night thinking of new angles. Former mobsters who spoke with shaking hands, knowing the dead don't always stay buried in silence. There was one story less public, but quietly haunting, that came from a retired union driver in the late 90s. He'd been drinking, sitting in a bar somewhere in northern Ohio. The place was nearly empty, just the clink of ice and glasses and the low hum of a TV in the corner. He told the bartender he'd once transported something years ago, something heavy, something sealed. He didn't ask questions, just followed orders. The drop was at a landfill in Jersey. He was paid well, told to forget. When asked if it had to do with Hoffa, he paused. Let's just say, he whispered, I never looked in the trunk. Is it true? Who knows? But stories like that hang in the air like smoke. Thin and tangible, but impossible to ignore. And maybe that's the quiet tragedy here, that the truth may not live in one man's confession or one document locked in a safe. It might be spread out like dust over decades, in old warehouses, in fields where the wind still moves gently through the grass. Sometimes I wonder what Hoffa would think of it all, his legacy wrapped in mystery, his name spoken in hushed tones. Would he laugh? Would he be angry? Or would he simply shake his head, knowing the world he helped build was always lined with shadows? Because make no mistake, he built something massive. For better or worse, he stood at the crossroads of labor and power, of loyalty and fear. And when he vanished, the tremor ran deep. Some say it ended with a bullet, others with concrete. Some believe it ended in betrayal, but maybe, in a strange way, it hasn't ended at all. The whispers are still out there. The theories continue to swirl like fog rolling in over a distant landscape. Each one carries its own weight, its own conviction, its own truth, or perhaps its own deception. Over the years, the search for Jimmy Hoffa has woven a tangled web of stories, half-truths, and speculation. And among all of them, there's one theory that sticks out, one that continues to shape the conversation. It's a theory that goes beyond whispers in bars, beyond confessions from aging men with stories that can't quite be pinned down. No, this theory is more concrete, because some say Hoffa's final resting place is buried deep beneath the foundations of Giants Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Giants Stadium, at the time of Hoffa's disappearance, was under construction, and the theory suggests that Hoffa's body was disposed of beneath the concrete, where no one would dare disturb it. The theory gained some traction in the late 1970s, with whispers of mobsters involved in the labor for the stadium's construction. Men who had connections with Hoffa and had their own reasons to want him gone. The idea behind this theory is simple. If you want to hide a body in plain sight, there's no better place than in the very foundation of something that will be built up, poured over, and sealed away for decades. A place where the earth itself is shifted, and the hands of construction workers, with all their heavy machinery, ensure that no one will dig too deep. In the late 1990s, a former mobster named Salvatore Sammy, the Bull Gravano, infamous figure in the Gambino crime family, was questioned about the disappearance. He never gave a direct confession, but his answer left some room for doubt. He hinted that Hoffa's body was disposed of beneath the stadium, not far from where the massive concrete was laid. It made sense, at least to some. The timing of Hoffa's disappearance in 1975 lined up with the stadium's construction. The right people were in the right places at the right time, and so the theory spread. But as is often the case with these types of mysteries, The whispers soon became louder, and soon enough an attempt was made to put this theory to the test. In 2003, a team of investigators, led by a New Jersey detective named Steve O'Donnell, visited the site, hoping to unearth any remnants of Hoffa. But despite spending hours digging and probing beneath the old stadium, they found nothing. No bones, no clothing, no trace of the Teamster boss. The ground beneath the stadium was thick with layers of earth, steel, and concrete. It was a dead end. And yet, there's something strangely fitting about it. A body lost in the foundation of something as massive as the stadium, buried under so much weight that even the strongest efforts couldn't uncover it. That's the story many people tell themselves when they think about Hoffa's fate. That he's not just gone, he's been absorbed into something larger, something beyond reach, forever part of a structure that still looms large over the landscape. But this theory, like all the others, is far from conclusive. The idea that Hoffa's body is buried beneath a stadium might seem as plausible as it does improbable. It's another piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit into place. And yet it's been cemented into the mythos of Hoffa's disappearance. Still, there's a part of me that wonders, what does it say about a man when his final resting place becomes as much a part of his legend as the deeds he did while alive? Hoffa built empires, led unions, and played a pivotal role in shaping an entire era of American labor. Yet here he is, buried in theories, forever tangled in a web of uncertainty. For those who still search, it's not just about finding a body, it's about understanding a man, and perhaps understanding the world that allowed a man like Hoffa to exist in the first place. It's like searching for a ghost that hasn't fully left the room. Even in death, Hoffa's influence lingers. People still feel the tug of his absence. They want answers, and they want closure. But I wonder, what would Hoffa think of all this, if he could see it? The stadium, the diggers, the books, the interviews, the endless stream of theories, each one getting closer to the truth, and yet somehow never quite grasping it. Would he be amused? Would he take satisfaction in the fact that so many are still obsessed with him long after the world moved on? Or perhaps he'd just smile to himself, knowing that the answer was something no one would ever find. Not really. Theories carved in concrete, like ancient runes, stand as symbols of something larger than any one person. They speak of the difficulty of understanding a life that was as complicated as Hoffa. The more we dig, the less we know. And perhaps, in a strange way, that's the most fitting tribute to a man whose life and death will always be shrouded in mystery. The search, it seems, will never end. The influence of silence is a powerful thing. Over the years, it became apparent that Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance was not merely the result of a single moment of violence or betrayal, but the culmination of years of complicated power dynamics and relationships, many of them bound in secrecy. For Hoffa, a man who rose to the heights of American labor, whose name was synonymous with the Teamsters, to vanish as if he had never existed at all, was this the natural consequence of his pursuit of power? Or was something far more calculated, far more deliberate? When Hoffa walked into that Detroit restaurant in 1975, he was a man on a mission. Despite being released from prison and attempting to rebuild his empire, Hoffa's ties to the mob and his determination to regain control of the Teamsters seemed to place him on a dangerous path. His return to the Union wasn't merely about leadership, it was a battle for control, a struggle that would pit him against the same men who had once been his allies, men who now feared what he might do if given too much influence once again. As Hoffa sought to reclaim the power he once wielded, his enemies were closing in from every side. The mob, who had long used the Union for their own purposes, were no longer willing to share. Hoffa had once been their partner, but now he was seen as a loose end, a potential problem, something to be removed before he could disrupt their profitable arrangements. What's most haunting is the thought that, in his final moments, Hoffa must have known what was happening, that he was walking into a trap set by the very people he had trusted, his ambition blinding him to the danger that lingered just beyond the veil of his plans. This, too, is a pattern seen throughout his life, a man, driven by ambition, but often blind to the consequences of his actions. But Hoffa's disappearance isn't just the story of a man. It's the story of systems of power, secrecy, and silence that have shaped the very nature of his legacy. You see, what makes this case so unsettling is not just that Hoffa vanished, but that, for decades, the people who might know what happened to him have chosen to remain silent. Silence can be as powerful as any weapon, as effective as any bullet. It ensures that some questions never receive answers, that some truths remain buried beneath layers of deceit. Take, for example, the rumors surrounding Hoffa's ties to the Mafia. Many, over the years, have speculated that Hoffa's downfall was linked to his interference with mob operations, particularly his attempts to cut the Mafia's control over the Teamsters pension fund. The fund was a goldmine for organized crime, and Hoffa, once the power player at its helm, was now seen as a liability. In trying to reclaim his position, he had made enemies not just within his union, but within the powerful underworld that had long held sway over it. Those who might have known what happened to Hoffa have kept their lips sealed, either out of fear or loyalty. But that silence itself is a story, one that speaks to the unspoken agreement between the powerful, a pact to protect one another from the consequences of their actions. Then there are the more chilling whispers, the ones that suggest Hoffa's disappearance was no accident, no unfortunate series of events, but the deliberate and carefully orchestrated removal of a man who had become a threat to everything those in power had worked to build. It's easy to imagine the quiet tension in those final hours before Hoffa vanished, the muffled conversations, the shuffling of feet, the faint sounds of shifting papers, all playing their part in a grand narrative where the stakes were not just Hoffa's life, but the future of an empire built on power, secrets, and most importantly, control. It's in the silence, the refusal to speak, that the most disturbing truths are often hidden. The fact that, after so many years, no one has come forward with definitive information about what happened that afternoon only deepens the mystery. Even more troubling is the notion that those with the power to reveal the truth, or at least point the way, have chosen not to. Is it out of loyalty, fear, or perhaps a deeper understanding that to speak would unravel something far larger, something that, once exposed, could never be put back together again? What we're left with, then, are the fragments of a story, the half-answers and suggestions that people have left behind in their wake, theories that emerge, time and again, like fleeting wisps in the dark, each one leading us in circles, never quite arriving at the truth. The theories themselves are a puzzle, as complex as the man at the center of them. Some suggest Hoffa was buried in a New Jersey landfill. Others believe his body was dissolved in acid, while a few insist that he was secretly disposed of somewhere close to Detroit. And yet, no one can say for certain. No one can tell us what really happened that day. All we are left with are the ghostly echoes of a man whose life was as shadowed and mysterious as the circumstances of his disappearance. But it's important to remember, these are not just the echoes of a single man's fate. They are the ripples of something larger, of power structures, criminal networks, and the eerie silence that surrounds the stories we never hear. There are those who would argue that Jimmy Hoffa's story isn't just about a man disappearing. It's about a system of power that can make people disappear. And in that, perhaps, we find the real lesson of Hoffa's life and disappearance. That power, when unchecked, can be more absolute than we can imagine. It can erase a person, not just from existence, but from the very memory of those who lived through the events. This, perhaps, is Hoffa's true legacy. Not the Union leader, not the man who built an empire, but the quiet reminder that the most dangerous forces are often the ones that remain unseen, waiting in the shadows, whispering their silence to those willing to listen. And yet, there remains something deeply unsettling about the whole story. The silence speaks volumes. The absence of answers seems to suggest that the truth is out there, but it will never come into the light. It will always remain shrouded in mystery, just as Hoffa's final days remain hidden beneath a veil of secrecy. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa remains, to this day, one of America's most elusive and tantalizing mysteries. A story wrapped in shadows, secrets, and unanswered questions. As the years have passed, theories have come and gone, but none have brought us any closer to the truth. The facts, the details, the whispered accounts all swirl around Hoffa's vanishing act, creating a swirling fog of uncertainty that still hangs over the case. Yet, as we reach the end of this story, we are left with a haunting truth. Some mysteries, no matter how much we try to solve them, are destined to remain unsolved. Hoffa's story is as much about the man himself as it is about the system in which he operated. A system that perhaps can make people disappear without a trace. The ties between the Teamsters, the Mafia, and the highest echelons of American power cannot be easily undone. They are sewn together by ambition, loyalty, and the kind of secrecy that runs so deep. It's hard to imagine anyone ever fully unraveling it. Jimmy Hoffa didn't just fall victim to his own ambition. He became entangled in a web of power that was as opaque as the night itself. As we look back, it's easy to see how Hoffa's disappearance was a logical conclusion to the dangerous life he led. But no matter how many years pass, we still can't help but feel the tension of that final moment. That single action, that one seemingly mundane choice, is the last piece of a puzzle that will never be completed. What was going through his mind? Did he know what awaited him? Or was he, as he had been for so much of his life, blinded by his own ambition, to certain that he could navigate the treacherous waters he was in? The investigation into Hoffa's disappearance has been as convoluted as the story itself. Over the years, many names have been thrown into the mix, suspects ranging from members of the Mafia to fellow Union members, who may have seen Hoffa as a threat. Some even believe Hoffa may have been involved in some kind of double-cross, that he was betrayed by those closest to him, left to disappear in a cruel twist of fate. What's most unsettling, perhaps, is the idea that the truth is out there, somewhere, hidden in plain sight. What if the answers were right in front of us all this time? Could Hoffa's disappearance be part of a much larger narrative story that stretches beyond the bounds of a single life, connecting us to the darker side of American history? If so, the story would never truly be solved, because the forces behind it are too vast, too complicated, and too powerful to ever be fully exposed. And so, we are left with the lingering specter of Jimmy Hoffa, a man who was larger than life, whose ambitions outstripped even his most daring dreams. But in the end, it was not his ambition that brought him down. It was the system he was part of, a system so entrenched and so opaque that it swallowed him whole. A system where power, money, and silence. Over the decades, countless theories have risen and fallen. Some suggest Hoffa was buried in the foundations of the Detroit Lions Stadium. Others that his body was disposed of in a mob-ruined garbage dump in New Jersey. The most chilling theory, perhaps, is the idea that Hoffa is still out there somewhere, a missing puzzle piece that might one day be found, but never truly understood. As each year passes without a resolution, the legend of Jimmy Hoffa grows, morphing into something bigger than the man himself. It becomes a symbol of the limits of human knowledge, of the ways in which power and secrecy can create unsolvable riddles. Yet, perhaps the most profound aspect of Hoffa's disappearance is that, despite all the theories, the endless investigations, and the attention it has received over the years, we still don't have an answer. Hoffa has remained missing, his legacy unchanged, his story still haunting us all. Could it be that the real answer lies not in the mystery of his disappearance, but in the very fact that we still seek it? The search for Jimmy Hoffa is as much about our own desire to uncover hidden truths as it is about his fate. We want answers, we need them, but at the same time, perhaps the not knowing is what keeps us coming back to the story time and time again. Hoffa's disappearance is a mirror reflecting the things we don't want to face, a reminder that some questions cannot be answered. After all, is it so different from the other great American mysteries? Think of all the things we'll never know, the quiet moments, the unseen corners of history, the untold stories that are lost in the sands of time. Hoffa's disappearance, in a way, is the last great mystery of an era. It sits there, in the shadows, waiting to be solved, but never quite being understood. In the end, Jimmy Hoffa is not just a man who vanished. He's a symbol of all the things we can never quite grasp. We're left with fragments of the past, pieces of a puzzle that will never fit together. As much as we try to find closure, the absence of it only makes the story more intriguing. It becomes part of the fabric of our shared history, this quiet, haunting story that we can never seem to escape. So, perhaps the greatest mystery isn't what happened to Jimmy Hoffa, but why we continue to search for the answer. Is it because we hope, in some small way, to unravel the hidden threads of power that bind us all? Or is it simply that, like the rest of the great American mysteries, Hoffa's story speaks to a part of us that wants to believe that the answers are out there, even if they remain forever just out of reach? In the end, Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance is, and will remain, one of America's most enduring secrets, a mystery that lingers like a shadow, ever present, but always just beyond our grasp. As we bring this journey to a close, we're left standing in the quiet aftermath of the mystery, as if the silence itself holds the answer we've been seeking all along. The story of Jimmy Hoffa, his rise, his fall, and the enigma of his disappearance remains a chapter of American history that may never be fully written. Some questions, it seems, are meant to remain unanswered, lingering in the shadows like whispers carried by the wind. Though Hoffa's fate remains uncertain, his legacy endures. His story, with all its twists and turns, continues to captivate, to intrigue, and to remind us of the hidden currents that run beneath the surface of history. And perhaps, in the end, it's this mystery, this sense of the unknowable, that makes it so compelling. We are drawn to it, not because we can solve it, but because it connects us to a deeper, more mysterious part of ourselves. If you've enjoyed this unsolved mystery, consider subscribing and joining us again for the next chapter. Until then, good night, and may the shadows of the past always intrigue and inspire you.